Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. This is a vocabulary video, and we're going to be talking about leasehold. So let's jump right in. When we talk about leasehold estate, this is a type of estate in land. If you remember from a previous video that I'll link at the end of this one, estate in land has two parts, freehold and leasehold. Freehold is ownership. Your rights, okay, the interest you have in the property is not for a fixed period of time, but with leasehold, it is for a period of time. And so when I see leasehold, what helps me remember is leases, rentals, and you're not talking about ownership, but then with freehold we're talking about ownership. So what is a lease? The lease is a contract. Okay, a lease is a contract between the landlord and the tenant. This gives the tenant rights to the property according to whatever is stated in the contract. Let's say on the exam they throw a question at you that's something like the tenant is wondering if they can paint the living room in a property that they're renting. Can they do this? The answer is always going to be whatever is stated in the lease. Okay, they need to check the lease to see what's in there because the lease is what gives the tenant rights to do whatever in that property. So that is the contract between the landlord and the tenant. So what's another word for the landlord? The landlord is also the lessor, the one giving the lease. Remember the OR at the end? While the tenant is the lessee with the EE at the end. Estate and tenancy. These two words are sometimes used interchangeably. So in leasehold, for example, you may see in your book or in questions estate for years, or you could see tenancy for years. It's the same thing. Estate from period to period or tenancy from period to period. Same concept. Now let's dive into estate for years. This is the type where it's for a period of time. There's always an expiration date. It could be a month, it could be a year, it could be you renting a place for 3 hours. As long as there is a definite period of time, it is an estate for years. And that's when the tenancy expires. So the tenant is required to vacate the premises once this expires. For example, let's say you rent a hall for a party. It's from 2 to midnight, 2 p.m. to midnight. At midnight, the landlord shouldn't be coming to serve you notice to move out. By midnight, you should be out of that rental space. With estate for years, if the landlord dies or the tenant dies, or if the property is sold, the lease is still in effect unless the lease has a clause in it that says when the property is sold, the lease will terminate. And that is your estate for years. Estate from period to period. This is not for a definite period of time. However, it is from one period to another. So there is no expiration date with the period to period. For example, it could be month to month, it could be year to year, but it's one that automatically renews from period to period. So once you pay your rent, you're essentially renewing it for the next period. In your book, under estate from period to period, they give you some dates. For example, if you need to cancel a lease that's month to month, you need to give 1 month's notice. If it's a yearly lease, you need to give at least 60 days notice. If it's week to week, you need to give 7 days notice. So know those for the exam as well. A holdover tenancy. Holdover tenancy occurs when a person initially has an estate for years, but then they convert it to an estate from period to period. For example, you rent an apartment for 1 year. At the end of 1 year, your landlord doesn't necessarily renew your lease for another year, but you pay your rent and they accept the rent. They've renewed your lease for another month. And that's called a holdover tenancy. Estate at will. This is a type of tenancy whereby the tenant leases the property, but there is no time frame. It's not period to period. It's just they're there until they leave. and the landlord has given permission for this. You could find this lease. For example, let's say you have a family member move in with you and they're paying you rent. Maybe they're in school, and so once school is up, they're going to move. Or once they get a job, we don't know when they're going to get that job. So once they get the job, then they're going to move. Also, maybe you work as a person works as a nanny. As long as they have the nanny job, they're a living nanny. So as long as they have that nanny job, they live in the property. Once the job is done, then their tenancy essentially expires. One thing to know about estate at will is if the owner dies, the lease terminates. Estate as sufferance. If you look at this word, you can see the word suffer in there, right? Right. So there's suffer right here. So if this is about suffering, guess what? This is something that's harming the landlord. So this is where a tenant refuses to move out after their lease has expired. And the landlord wants them out, but they refuse to move. For example, let's say someone just doesn't have money or good credit or whatever, and they can't move and get a new place, but they're not paying rent and their lease is up. The landlord wants them out so they can begin to collect rent from other people, but the person is not leaving. According to Illinois law, the landlord could, okay, it's a could, the landlord could charge this tenant up to 2 months' rent, 2 times the rent for staying longer than they should. Actual eviction. This is where the landlord evicts or gets the tenant out of the property because the tenant has breached the lease. In Illinois, the landlord cannot throw people's things out of the premises. They have to go through the courts or some sort of authority, right? Self help is not allowed. So, for a rental apartment, for example, if the person is not making payments, the landlord may want to kick them out. The landlord may want to turn off the utilities so they move out. The landlord may want to change the locks so they can get into the property. The landlord cannot do any of those things. The landlord must go through the courts and legally evict the person. This could take months, but that's just what the law states. Constructive eviction, on the other hand, is the reverse. At this point, the tenant is evicting themselves because the landlord has breached the contract. For example, if the property is inhabitable, meaning it doesn't have clean water or electricity is not functional or unsafe, if the building has multiple building violations that are just putting people at risk, in the winter time the heat has not been working for 2 months or something ridiculous like that, the tenant can choose to abandon the property. Now, if anyone's doing this, they must have proof, right? So however you can document this, it would be beneficial for the tenant to do so, so that if the landlord tries to come after you for the remainder of the lease, you have proof. An assignment. This is where a new tenant takes over all the rights and responsibilities of the previous tenant and takes on the original lease. So let's say tenant A is moving out of town, they get someone to take over their lease. Tenant B comes in and tenant B is now responsible for the rent, and the original tenant has no more responsibility for that property. A sublease, on the other hand, is where the original tenant is still responsible for the rent and any damages done to the property. So the only thing they don't have is the rights to possess or to live in the property. That's the right that the new tenant has. But if the new tenant is not making those payments, the landlord can come after the original tenant. A gross lease. A gross lease is where the tenant essentially has one fixed monthly rent, and that's how much they pay to the landlord. The landlord then will take care of taxes, maintenance, insurance on the building, and other building expenses. This you'll usually find in residential property. A net lease, on the other hand, is where the tenant pays the fixed rent, but they also have other expenses for the building. So they may be taking care of the taxes on the property, all the maintenance or some of the maintenance, insurance, and all of that. A triple net lease, which you may also see as NNN, so someone may just write NNN, and that is whereby the tenant is taking care of all the expenses and the landlord is just collecting rent. A percentage lease, also usually you'll find with commercial, this is where the tenant has a fixed minimum rent plus a percentage of gross income that they make at that property. So let's say you rent a space and you're running a retail store. Your base rent, for example, could be $2,500, but then if you make over $750,000, the landlord is going to take 5% of whatever you make in excess of 750. So example, you make a million. So 1 million minus 750 is 250,000. And then you would pay the landlord 5% of the $250,000 in addition to your regular rent. At the end, I have a question we'll go over with that. Ground lease, as the term says, you're leasing the ground, you're leasing the earth. So this is where the landlord, the landowner, leases a vacant land. The tenant takes that land and builds on it. In this situation, they usually have a triple net lease. And so, after building on the property, the tenant is responsible for all maintenance on the building, responsible for the taxes, insurance on the building, all of those things. The landlord is just collecting rent. When the lease is up, the tenant can knock down the building or leave the building there and move on to a different property. Ground leases sometimes will last up to 99 years or more. They are usually long term leases. Variable lease, as the word says, variable, meaning it's not going to stay the same. It's going to vary over time. It's usually going to increase during the term of the lease. So let's say you have a 5-year lease. Year one, you may be paying 1,500. Year two, you're paying 2,000. Year three, you're paying 2,500. If it's increasing by, like I see on the screen there, $500 a year, that's called a graduated lease. In some other instances, it could be increasing based on some index, based on some factor. The example I give on the screen here would be property taxes. So let's say the property taxes increase by 5%, then your rent will increase by 5%. If property taxes increase by 2%, your rent could increase by 2% as well. That is a variable lease, but it's an index lease. So graduated is the same amount every year. Index is based on some factor, some index. A sale and lease back. So think of that. You sell and then you lease the property back from the person you sold it to. This is where the seller becomes the tenant and the buyer becomes the landlord. The new owner becomes the landlord. You may do this if you need to free up cash instead of holding onto the real estate. And that's why a business could do this. And then for the buyer already has a tenant. If the numbers make sense, why not do a sale and lease back? That is all of our vocabulary today. And like I promised, here is a question about the percentage lease. A business owner rents a space for $1,800 a month plus 3% of gross sales over $950,000 per year. If the gross sales were $1,025,000, what was the average monthly rent? So remember, with a percentage lease, you're paying a base rent plus 3% of anything over the 950,000 in this question. So we want to figure out how much did we make over 950,000. So that would be 1,025,000 25,000 minus 950,000. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 75,000. So we want 3% of this. $75,000 times 3% is $2,250. And this is for the whole year. So let's go back to the question. The question says, if the gross sales were this, what was the average monthly rent? So we want to figure out how much they were paying every month, which was 1,800 plus this divided by 12. So 2250 divided by 12, let me do that on my calculator, is 187.5 per month. And so we're going to add that to our 1,800. And so every month, this is how their average based on their sales. If you have any questions, please leave that in the comment for me. With that, we've come to the end of today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give us a like. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe to this channel. I bring you videos to help you pass your Illinois real estate broker exam. Share this video also with your friends from school or people who you know are studying for the license examination. Hop on to this next video where I talk about freehold estate, which is another type of estate in land, and I will see you in the next video.